Framework is counter criticism.
Oh, get it right.
Can I put one
We are not ambiguous, we do not engage in the state of arguments that everyday politics do not insist on state action, but they are not exclusive arguments that we don't need the court to recognize beauty, not that we do not need to go to it. There is no reason as to why we should have to say we don't have a right to permute your counterplan, which is what they are asking us to do. Their argument that they should have run is that we have to be state action, and our argument is that the state is inevitable. You should extend the Bay evidence, which indicates that that the state is inevitable, and we must start with this recognition. That's the only way to have progressive politics. You should also accept the blank evidence. There are multiple arguments that place multiple subjectivities, negative framework, denies us access to beautiful life because it offers us no room to escape the current discourse of domination established by community, which necessitates to simply replicate dominant discourse. Vote affirmative to affirm the transformative potential of having a crack in their understanding of the topic of Detroit and ultimately of life itself. Will be as agency. Access to agency can only begin when we refute the assumptions without technical training and policy and passive onlookers. The fact that we must give you a definite answer to our be the state, etc. is the interpretation of stale and tired education that we reject. We begin to construct a space for debate that occurs ultimately free from the violence of the dominant discourse. We'll see that interpretations of this debate should not be stable. Centers should engage in a circular politics, which both at the cracks in dominant discourse. Resolution does not exist in the bubble. The state does not exist in the bubble. Instead, the resolution and the state are constantly happening to us, with us, and around us. Vote affirmative to engage in politics, recognize and embraces the unknowable nature of context. They have not read a single answer to our blanket evidence, which means that this is all against their framework. The idea that we should tell you, yes, we are a linear call to the state is exactly what our blanket evidence says is wrong, because the interpretations of our life are not stable. They are fluid. If we win our fluid argument, the entirety of this debate is game over for the negative. The case debate. The first argument is that we are criticism of the cultural politics that their Bay evidence talks about. Even if they win their arguments about the temporary autonomous zone, the combination of that with our blanket evidence and just the entirety of their argument. If we win the everyday forms of resistance within the confines of this room, temporality is something that you should embrace in this debate. Is an affirmative belt. There's also no alternative to any of these arguments other than using the state. If we win our criticisms of exclusive state focus, and this ad hom does not apply to our project. In other words, they have found cards with the words Bay and Taz in them, but they have not found evidence that answers the central notion of our argument. And this is also just an ad hom. It's not the way we deploy the Taz. In other words, our argument is that within the confines of this room, there's very little that they can access their link arguments. If we win any of our temporality good arguments, in other words, you should assign your ballot as a temporal embrace of politics, then we will win that you can have agency within this debate. That's the only argument we have to win the counterplan. The first argument is permutation, do both. This is the framework flow. The entirety of our winning C is not you should reject the state. Our argument is that inclusive state focus is bad because the state has attempted to find what is beautiful and what is ugly within Detroit, and that is bad. The next argument is that their method of education, sports rating, and authoritarian education is wrong. 2K6. So long as we defer response to critical thought, debate, and shaping and informs introducing our education, increasingly reducing imperatives of job training, our ideological demands of patriotic conformity, but there's little saying here that simply substitute training and education for ideological conformity of critical learning. Higher education is also starting to play in the construction of national security. State universities are to supply resources necessary to expand security imperatives of U.S. government, and we must retreat from their politics of community, authoritarian control, and information of life from Wilbroth in 1997. I believe the profoundly necessary to retreat from the global and limited history to totalitarian background companies movement philosophy drawn to the close, which is mean that the Gulag is in Nietzsche, that we have to find a case to that actually the various modes of completion of philosophical for the party state cycles of dictatorship. The retreat has to be active and necessary. All that be given to the other means lives behind the term the retreat to political friend, difference based on the agenda, the refusal, speed, refusal, intimidation, which because of regard to sacred is accidentally by political, which forces anyone to recon will show the hand and commitment self to they're called the state results in violent purification purges from Norris and 2K. To move from the individual's community will do us no good, where war is fundamental hostility, political life, external conflict is not only, or even the most pressing danger within the politics communal identity, conceived the community suffering the constitutive community identity, and the imminent truth of one's true or higher, or higher or more universal self on one shared communal identity that becomes work of politics, will not to bring forth the imminent communal identity. This will help purification of one's own community requires that we cleanse our community of foreigners and rid themselves of influence of such. Politics is a matter of discovering the imminent and implicit identity of the groups that work in setting and allowing it to access a self-functional activity. The next argument is ethics of lay, is that they exonerate responsibility by calling to the state from Rose 2K4 legal system tries to act in all areas for an individual that could be usefully pursued by violence, legal could be realized by legal powers, also represented itself is indispensable for any kind of concrete self-awareness capable of laws, less responsibility individual becomes legal institutions out of me for my social responsibility towards other making more proximity makes every other possible, the other becomes changes. And all too easy for more demands for justice here, present possibility more stakes for a new unconditional response to the other delegated ideology totalitarian institution involved. The impact is aside from Zupanich 2K, what made it possible for the Nazis to torture and kill millions of Jews was not simply that they thought their gods were the good difference had to be living without the fact that they felt it's missing God of some about ideas is the most dangerous and not potentially used to be bureaucrat. The basis of ethics not be imperative, which commands us to endorse and fine-tune burnouts and possible aspirations about the imperative, which must recognize here, find and occur something associated by product of our action. The next argument is history proves celebratory jurisprudence is school majority to maintain positions of privilege of God 2K6. Celebratory jurisprudence to proceed to actual conditions there and be acted on the benefit established when any other group celebrates some rights, advances, benefits, and majority and implies that a part of group satisfied demands and first step places the triumphals and encourage the oppressed group believe that has a chance to change all along as a broad landmark decision made from product far beyond the group's agency. If you examine these forces, you may find that simply came society quieting itself in favor to the minorities who sing and dance in the streets of great breakthrough victory. Easy forget what happened last time when the great victory melted away as soon as celebrations died down. You tend to lose your critical judgment, and it is dangerous to allow yourself to become incorporated in the language and categories of the law, sterilizes stories excluded by the narrow definitions of the created by institutional logic. Logado in 89. Putting the facts in the linguistic code required to course sterilize them, even if successful complaint could have legitimized a social litigation, seem a revolutionary activity that serves a civil rights litigation, also demeans, humbles, and victimizes the victim, bringing outrage and converting him or her into a supplicant. Stories do not see as a part of the body of real wisdom. It is also against self-jujitsu, fascist litigation. Does stories attack the subvert very institutional logic of the system on the rare occasion of the law form litigation is effective for relax a hard one. New rights are quickly stolen away without interpretation, foot dragging, delaying, outright obstruction. Story success is not so easily circumvented by telling his point is registered as a table stock story would never be the same. And finally is transference. The law does not remedy anything but helping the majority. This process is transference, which proves the law does not solve any discrimination, only shifts it. Delgado TK3. Brought in an official school segregation of African American children, the precise time of Congress ordering operation by background which 1.3 million Mexicans, Mexican Americans, many of them lawful U.S. citizens, deported new tribes and Winnie streets and back and breakthroughs all the time. California has been active since the Latino belt measures, checkerboard of racial history, the progress of one group and true interest in other features, innumerable similar examples as a product of psychological phenomenon of transference and displacement when it occurs when we feel toward one person to be focused on another defenses and more exploitable members of public group by despair, discharge, frustration of non-members and cause those others to attack criticism. The first argument is permutation to both. The first argument is that no link except the Black evidence. We will win that individual modes of everyday resistance are key to solve their link arguments are about corporate-driven pedagogy. This is not us. We are an active resistance. Again, the state and the criticism is also not competitive with our politics. If the alternative can have a temporal crack in the dominant discourse and is compatible with our affirmative is this rejection of the linear notion of politics, which allows for progressive forms of everyday resistance. We are not politics that the link argument assumes. We engage in a form of circular everyday politics, which is constantly shifting, inhabiting different spaces for resistance. We are a refusal to engage in the dominant ideology's notion of power is controlling our existence, and instead we recognize that we become agents and will power by engaging in everyday acts of agency. And obviously our evidence is offensive delays that revolution fails. The alternative only replicate falsely criticizes when the alternative reaches the level of simulation that martyrdom and cooptation occurs. Only the affirmative can avoid violence by refusing to engage a system to criticize the beats of visibility. They cannot access their link. Arguments because our politics is too temporal for power to access. We live the moment, disagree on the second again. They cannot access their impact claims because they are not tied to the moment. And the Giroux evidence is affirmative. You should extend the counterplay piece of evidence. We are not narcissism, instead we are action of individual everyday resistance. The question of what is the public sphere is damning for them. The entire point of our Black evidence is that when you have a constructed notion of the public sphere as the government, which they are tied to, that necessarily excludes voices and other forms of resistance. That links them back to their Giroux evidence, because the concept that the public sphere is all that is neoliberalism. It is the idea that the only place that progress can happen, the state, etc., links them back to all of our arguments about corporation, the corporatization of education. And they have no uniqueness. The status quo is capitalism, etc. Their pedagogy arguments are all inherent within the current school system. The Giroux evidence is talking about something as radical as the affirmative, not the negative. They have no mechanism to solve their arguments. Are also not neoliberalism. We are free to break away from corporatization. The underlying parts of the Giroux evidence is damning for them. They try to posture in cross-sex, but it will not work. They simply incorporate minority students into the corporatization of public education, i.e. the concept that the school books, the texts, etc. are all what Giroux is criticizing. Their pedagogy and their counterplan are contradictory arguments that only when we engage in a form of everyday resistance, which refuses the ability of corporations to control what is the public sphere, what is education, etc. Can we break away from the neoliberal order? The next argument is a permutation to do both. Their pedagogy is more in line with the affirmative than the negative, and also pedagogy is the affirmative argument. In other words, if we win a pedagogy of everyday resistance, i.e. our Bleicher evidence, then their Bay answers are a little more than ad homs. The temporality of our argument means that we do not have to win that the temporary autonomous zone is good in every instance. We simply have to win in this instance. Your ballot can serve as an affirmation of the beauty of Detroit.